In this video, I'll give you a basic introduction to hormones during exercise. Hormones are important for many things in the human body, but they're especially in charge of adaptations for exercise, such as your heart beating faster, your muscles tensing up, or even the pee you've been holding in for the past few hours magically vanishing. This is all what we know as fight or flight mode, by the way. So first, I'm gonna give a simple overview of what hormones are and how they work on a cellular and systemic level, and then I'll explain how exactly they affect exercise and give an overview of the 6 fundamental ones at play. So if you already know what hormones are and the basics of how they work, then feel free to skip around, I guess, or don't for a good refresher. In any case, before I begin, I just want to say that this video is going to be episode 1 of my exercise physiology series, where I explain the body's responses and adaptations to exercise on a very basic level. So this is for all the athletes, gym rats, or just pre-med / health students, or just anyone who wants to learn more about the body and exercise. And I want to emphasize that this is purely educational. So I know there's already tons of gym tutorials, fitness tutorials all over the web. Who knows, some of them are right, some of them are wrong. But the main point of this series is to explain things both from a scientific perspective and in a simple way that anyone can understand. So if you don't know what a VO2 max is or anything, you don't need to know that, and everything will be explained to you. So if you don't know anything about the factors affecting exercise, such as hormones, but want to know more, you found the right series. Let's get started. And for the record, if you see my eyes darting around, I'm just reading my notes. So what are hormones? The whole purpose of hormones is to allow communication between cells. So let's start there. How do cells communicate with each other? When you're starving, how does your stomach tell your brain that it's hungry? And when you go to eat food, how does your brain tell your mouth to open? Basically, there are 2 systems in charge of this, the nervous system and the endocrine system. The nervous system is your body's communication network made up of nodes called nerves. They send electrical signals to each other. That's how they communicate. This network is direct because all the nerves are interconnected and they send signals directly to each other. It's also nearly instantaneous because the electrical signals travel at lightning speed, which you might guess yourself, and is responsible for pretty much all the body's conscious decision making and the traditional 5 senses. For example, when you touch a hot stove, you feel pain instantly because your hand communicates to your brain using nerves. And when you want to open your mouth to eat, your brain communicates to your mouth using nerves. All these events happen directly and pretty much instantly, and that's pretty much the nervous system. Now, behind the scenes is the endocrine system, which is the main focus for today. The endocrine system is your body's communication network made up of glands that release chemical molecules into the bloodstream. These glands are called endocrine glands, and these chemical molecules are called hormones. So what are hormones? They're the chemical messengers of the endocrine system. Unlike nerves, the majority of endocrine glands aren't interconnected and they just kind of sit there by themselves. So because of this, the endocrine glands must communicate via the circulatory system, as in they send the hormones into the bloodstream where the hormones travel around the body with the blood. This means that the endocrine system has a global effect because the bloodstream reaches all corners of the body. So once a group of hormones are released from the endocrine gland into the bloodstream, they will bind to all the cells that they're able to until they all bind and there's no more left. So it's basically kind of an all or nothing type of situation. This also means that the endocrine system has a slow effect because it takes a while for the hormones to travel in the bloodstream and they can stay in there for a while. This is very different than electrical signals, which come and go at lightning speed. The endocrine system is responsible for homeostasis and the majority of the body's unconscious decision making, such as growth spurts, period cramps, temperature regulation, and also more complex sensations such as hunger. So pretty much all the things you can't control. And these effects are more gradual than touching a hot stove and feeling pain, for example. So for a quick recap, the nervous system is direct and instantaneous, communicating by sending electrical signals through nerves. And meanwhile, the endocrine system is global and slow, communicating by sending hormones into the bloodstream. Now that we've covered the basics of cell communication and what hormones are, let's zoom in on how they work on a cellular level. So I already said hormones, they're released into the bloodstream by endocrine glands, but how do they actually have an effect on anything? So the way this works is they keep traveling into the bloodstream until they're destroyed or they reach their target cells. Target cells are cells that contain receptors that bind these hormones. It's kind of like a lock and key type of thing. There are around 200 types of hormones in the human body, each with their unique 3D shapes. Each of them binds to a receptor, which has an empty slot in the unique shape of that hormone. So basically, the hormone is the key and the receptor is the lock. So this is basically how hormones actually affect the cells. They bind to the cells. So there are a few things to keep in mind with this. Not every cell in the body has receptors for each type of hormone. This means that although most hormones travel everywhere in the body, not every hormone has an effect on every cell, only the cells that have its receptor. With that being said, many of the major types of hormones do have receptors across most of the cells of the body. This means that the same type of hormone can have different effects on different types of cells. For example, the same type of hormone that's released by the stomach that travels to your brain and tells you that you're hungry can also bind to your testicles and suppress testosterone production. Also, some types of hormones have very similar shapes and thus can compete for the same receptor. For example, estrogen and progesterone, which are two reproductive hormones, both bind to the uterus, which is the female reproductive organ that holds the fetus. But estrogen causes the uterus lining to grow while progesterone causes it to stall. So once a hormone binds to its receptors, it can affect the cell in three different types of ways. The first way is that they open up doors to the cell for specific molecules to pass in and out. The second way is that they alter DNA activity and therefore change which molecules the cell produces. And the third way is that they move up other receptors to the surface of the cell or deeper into the cell, which other molecules, such as other hormones, can bind to. It's also important to mention that hormones aren't infinite. The range that hormones travel in the bloodstream and thus how many cells they impact are limited by four things: the rate at which hormones are released from the endocrine gland, the rate at which hormones are kicked out from the body as waste, the amount of hormone receptors present, and the amount of water present in the bloodstream. So basically, a single receptor can only bind to one hormone. So the more hormones a gland releases, the more cells the hormones are able to affect. The body is also always getting rid of hormones from the bloodstream and pees it out as waste. This ensures that hormones aren't just stuck in your body forever. And the more cells with receptors there are, the more cells the hormone is able to affect. And because hormones travel in the bloodstream, water in the bloodstream, known as plasma, can actually bind the hormones themselves. This essentially blocks the hormones from reaching their target cells. So the more plasma in the blood, the more hormones bind to the plasma instead. So that's a basic summary of hormones on the cell level. If you want to know more about this in detail, that's a whole another topic, probably related to cell biology. Anyways, now let's move on to the broader level of the human system. Despite what you might think, endocrine glands don't just randomly release hormones. There's actually a very tightly regulated system behind this. In your brain lies the control center of the endocrine system, made up of three glands: the hypothalamus and the two pituitary glands, which are the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. Anterior means front and posterior means back, by the way. They both sit under the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is like your endocrine system's brain, which is also in your brain. That's kind of trippy. It controls most of the hormones in your body, but in addition to being an endocrine gland, it also controls the autonomic nervous system, aka the part of the nervous system that you don't consciously control. This is the link between the nervous system and the endocrine system. Basically, sensory nerves all across the body detect what's happening, and they send that info to the hypothalamus through electrical signals. The hypothalamus then processes that information and produces and releases hormones accordingly. So the hypothalamus produces many hormones that have direct effects in the body, but it actually doesn't release any of these itself. Instead, it sends hormones to the posterior pituitary, which it's directly innervated to, meaning it's connected through nerves. The posterior pituitary doesn't produce any hormones, and its only job is to store and release hormones into the bloodstream that the hypothalamus produces. So basically, the hypothalamus accesses the body through the posterior pituitary, which it controls using nerves. It's kind of like the hypothalamus is a king who's missing his arms, and the posterior pituitary is his prosthetic arm. I made that up just for the sake of the video, by the way. But that's not the only way the hypothalamus reaches the body. It produces what are called trophic hormones. These are hormones that don't have direct effects, but instead cause the release of other hormones from other endocrine glands. And the hypothalamus actually directly releases these trophic hormones, but not to the rest of the body. Instead, it releases them to a specific part of the bloodstream, a network of blood vessels that directly connects it to the anterior pituitary. This network is called the hypophyseal portal system. So while the posterior pituitary is directly connected to the hypothalamus via nerves, the anterior pituitary is connected to the hypothalamus via this portal system. The anterior pituitary produces and releases both hormones that affect the rest of the body and its own trophic hormones, according to the will of the hypothalamus. How this works is that the hypothalamus produces and releases trophic hormones that travel through the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system and bind to the anterior pituitary. So upon binding, the anterior pituitary produces and releases its own hormones into the bloodstream, some of which have direct effects on the body, and others of which bind to other endocrine glands and tell them to produce and release their own hormones. So to summarize, we got a king with its prosthetic arm, but he also has a duke, which is the anterior pituitary that carries out his orders, and the duke also orders around his own knights, which are the other endocrine glands all across the body. So the king, his prosthetic arm, and the duke make up the control center of the kingdom, which is the endocrine system in this case. And that's pretty much all I got. Now let's get to the fun stuff. Finally, the question you've been waiting for. How do hormones affect exercise? Under normal circumstances, the endocrine system releases them to maintain homeostasis, aka the normal conditions of your body, such as a 120/80 blood pressure and a blood sugar level less than 100 milligrams per deciliter, to name a few. Basically numbers you can ask your doctor for. But exercise is a deviation away from these normal conditions, from homeostasis. It's a biological stressor because during exercise, your body needs more energy, water, oxygen, etc. And depending on the intensity and duration of the exercise, aka how hard it is and how long you do it for, the needs can be a little more or a lot more, or anywhere in between. So in order to meet these increased demands, your body temporarily raises its set points. This is known as adaptive homeostasis. That's why when you work out, your heart beats faster, your blood pressure rises, your blood sugar rises, and you suddenly don't need to pee anymore. And your body accomplishes this through hormones. So how do hormones affect exercise? By raising homeostatic set points in order to meet its demands, aka that adaptive homeostasis. And this basically starts at the hypothalamus. Normally, the autonomic nervous system is in full rest and digest mode, which is basically the opposite of fight or flight mode. This is called parasympathetic tone, but the stresses of exercise actually cause the nervous system to shift to fight or flight mode, which is called sympathetic tone. You've probably learned in 8th grade science class that when you see danger, your body goes into that fight or flight mode. It's the same thing for exercise. The more stress, aka the more need for energy and other stuff, the stronger the shift from parasympathetic to sympathetic tone will be. So this change is sensed by the hypothalamus, which responds accordingly by causing the release of hormones. And so the stronger the sympathetic tone, the more hormones the hypothalamus will signal to release. So now let's dive deeper into the specifics. This is the part where things get a little brain twisting, and there's a lot of info. So hang in there as I try my best to explain. I'm pretty much going to be reading off my notes for this one. So there are 6 fundamental hormones responsible for adaptive homeostasis. The first 2, which are epinephrine and norepinephrine, are responsible for further increasing sympathetic tone. The next 2, which are growth hormone and cortisol, along with those first 2, are all responsible for increased fuel storage breakdown. And the last 2, which are antidiuretic hormone and aldosterone, are responsible for adaptive blood flow. So let's start with the first 2. Epinephrine and norepinephrine, aka adrenaline and noradrenaline, are collectively known as catecholamines. They're produced and released by the adrenal medulla, which is directly innervated by the hypothalamus. This makes them part of the fast response of exercise, as the hypothalamus directly controls their release via electrical signals. This means that when you start exercising, the catecholamines are released immediately, and they're responsible for magnifying sympathetic tone. Let me explain. The direct stresses of exercise cause the initial nervous system shift from parasympathetic to sympathetic tone. But after that, the catecholamines are the ones perpetuating this sympathetic tone, making it stronger. An increased sympathetic tone leads to increased hormone release, and there's a cycle and it repeats. This is called a positive feedback loop, because once exercise starts, the catecholamines basically cause their own release, along with the release of other hormones, and this loop doesn't stop until exercise stops. In addition to hormone release, sympathetic tone also causes the nervous system to increase heart rate and blood pressure, so catecholamines are essentially responsible for this as well, through the positive feedback loop. In addition to that, catecholamines, along with growth hormone and cortisol, are also responsible for fuel storage breakdown. First, let me give you a little background about fuel. Most of your cells in your body need fuel, aka energy, hence why you eat food, because food gives you energy. There are 3 main types of fuel your body uses: carbohydrates, aka carbs, fats, and proteins. You've probably heard of them before. They're called macronutrients, and you probably get them in your diet every day. You get carbs through bread, rice, and veggies, and proteins and fats through meats, nuts, and tofu. stuff like that. So during digestion, your body breaks down these macronutrients into micronutrients so they can be absorbed into the bloodstream. Because in the bloodstream, these micronutrients are then able to travel all over the body and fuel all the cells. So carbs get broken down into glucose, fats get broken down into free fatty acids, and proteins get broken down into amino acids, and these all circulate in the blood. But too many micronutrients in your bloodstream isn't healthy either. That's what you call high blood sugar levels, which I briefly mentioned earlier. Like I said, the normal level is below 100 milligrams of micronutrients per deciliter of blood. Luckily, your digestive organ called the pancreas is constantly monitoring your blood sugar levels and regulating it. So in order to prevent blood sugar levels from exceeding 100, your pancreas produces and releases hormones called insulin. Insulin is responsible for the uptake of micronutrients into cells all across your body to use as energy. And it's also responsible for the storage of excess micronutrients into certain cells. In both these scenarios, the micronutrients leave the blood, thus lowering your blood sugar levels. For storage, once micronutrients enter the cell, they're built up again into bigger molecules. So glucose is stored as glycogen in your liver and muscles. Amino acid is stored back as protein in your muscles, and free fatty acids and any more excess glucose and amino acid is stored all around your body as adipose tissue, aka fat. But after nutrients get stored and your cells use all the ones available in the bloodstream, blood sugar levels drop and there's no more fuel available. That's when your pancreas produces and releases hormones called glucagon. Glucagon is responsible for breaking down liver and muscle glycogen back into glucose and releasing it into the bloodstream, where your hungry cells can then use as fuel. Well, what about fats and proteins, you might wonder? That's what growth hormone and cortisol are for, which I'll get to in a bit. Together, insulin and glucagon are responsible for the homeostasis of blood sugar levels, and they basically do opposite things. Insulin pulls blood glucose into the cells for storage or use, and glucose takes it out and back into the bloodstream. But anyway, back to adaptive fuel storage breakdown. As I said earlier, during exercise, your active muscles have an increased demand for fuel, so your body resorts to breaking down stores all around and releasing those micronutrients into the blood. That's why during exercise, your blood sugar levels elevate beyond 100 milligrams per deciliter, and that's perfectly normal. As I mentioned earlier, catecholamines, growth hormone, and cortisol are the hormones responsible for this. Catecholamines stimulate the pancreas to release more glucagon and inhibit it from releasing insulin. This promotes the breakdown of glycogen into blood glucose and prevents cells from uptaking more micronutrients for use and storage. Growth hormone is produced by the hypothalamus and released into the bloodstream by the posterior pituitary. So it's also a fast-acting hormone, just like the catecholamines, and its normal function is to build up the amino acids as protein in the muscles, as the growth part suggests. It also promotes fat breakdown into free fatty acid and releases it into the bloodstream, and it prevents the storage of glucose as liver and muscle glycogen. It also stimulates liver gluconeogenesis, which is the production of new glucose in the liver. Now, cortisol is produced and released by the adrenal cortex. First, the hypothalamus releases the trophic hormone called corticotrophin releasing hormone into the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system, where it then binds to the anterior pituitary. There, it causes it to release another trophic hormone called adrenocorticotropic hormone into the bloodstream. And there, it finally binds to the adrenal cortex, which releases cortisol. This cascade is called the HPA axis, standing for hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal. And it makes cortisol a slow-acting hormone because that pathway takes a while. There's so many steps involved. So just like growth hormone, cortisol promotes fat breakdown into free fatty acid in blood, prevents storage of glucose as liver and muscle glycogen, and stimulates liver gluconeogenesis. But unlike growth hormone, cortisol actually promotes the breakdown of muscle protein into blood amino acid, which is honestly the complete opposite of growth hormone. So you can kind of see how growth hormone and cortisol are like yin and yang. While they function the same for the most part, growth hormone builds up the muscles, while cortisol breaks them down. That's why growth hormone is released in huge amounts during growth spurts, and cortisol is known as the stress hormone. And because cortisol is so slow acting, the amount released is actually proportional to exercise intensity, aka how hard your workout is. So it's actually suppressed during light exercise. That's why people say a light jog is good for your mental health, because it lowers your stress hormone levels. And luckily, growth hormone is released along with cortisol during exercise to prevent muscle breakdown, because if that weren't the case, exercise would probably actually cause you to lose muscle. So the catecholamines, growth hormone, and cortisol are all responsible for elevating blood sugar levels. Catecholamines cause glucagon to elevate blood glucose, and growth hormone and cortisol levels elevate free fatty acids in the blood, and cortisol also elevates blood amino acid levels. But at this point, you might also be wondering, if muscle cells need more energy during exercise, and insulin is responsible for the uptake of micronutrients into the cell for energy, then why in the world would it be suppressed during exercise? It seems very counterintuitive, but this is actually a very interesting concept. It's because insulin is a hormone, so it must affect every cell in the body that it binds to, because it's a global signal. But on the other hand, exercise requires localized signals to get energy only to the active muscle cells that really need it. So insulin is bad for exercise. So during exercise, your body uses non-hormonal mechanisms to get energy into muscle cells because they need a specific mechanism to get it just into the muscle cells and not really any other places. So I plan to cover this in another video, so stay tuned. But definitely look this up on your own if you're curious. Finally, let's go over antidiuretic hormone and aldosterone, which are responsible for adaptive blood flow and are the last two hormones for this video. As I explained just earlier, during exercise, your active muscles need more micronutrients for energy. So because the bloodstream is where the micronutrients, along with other important stuff such as oxygen and carbon dioxide, circulate, your body needs faster blood flow to the active muscles during exercise in order to deliver those micronutrients faster. So there are two main ways your body increases blood flow to the muscles. One, by increasing blood plasma volume, and two, by decreasing blood flow in the body. But wait, that second part sounds very counterintuitive as well. But it's kind of like what I said about insulin and exercise. I'll get to it in a bit. First, let's talk about blood plasma, which, as I said earlier, is just water in the blood. If you don't have enough blood plasma, your overall blood volume decreases and blood flow slows down, because think about it like a dry river. A river with just a little water won't flow as fast. But at the same time, if there's too much blood volume, blood flow also slows down because of the resistance against the walls of the blood vessels. So in order for blood flow to be optimized, there needs to be a balance of blood plasma. But during exercise, your body releases lots of water to cool you down because your muscles contract and generate lots of heat. This is known as sweating, by the way. So you're losing blood plasma during exercise. In response to this, your body tries to retain as much water as possible, and it does this at the kidneys. The kidneys are responsible for filtering out waste from blood, where the waste eventually gets expelled as pee. But by doing this, it must also filter out plasma from the blood. The filtered blood plasma, along with waste, is known as filtrate, and it eventually becomes urine. Luckily, there are certain mechanisms to reabsorb water from the filtrate, which are activated by antidiuretic hormone and aldosterone. Antidiuretic hormone, also known as ADH or vasopressin, is produced by the hypothalamus and directly released into the bloodstream by the posterior pituitary, so it's a fast-acting hormone. What it does is it binds to the kidneys, where it increases the expression of aquaporins, aka water channels, at the collecting ducts, which are the things that transport the filtrate to the bladder. Because of this increased aquaporin expression, water in the filtrate of the collecting ducts move back into the bloodstream, aka reabsorption. Aldosterone, on the other hand, is released by the adrenal cortex, just like cortisol. Normally, the release is mediated by the RAAS, which is a whole nother topic, but during exercise, the adrenal cortex releases extra aldosterone through the same HPA axis as cortisol. So it's also a slow-acting hormone, just like cortisol. So what aldosterone does is it binds to the kidneys, where it increases reabsorption of solutes at the peritubular capillaries, which are blood vessels that allow for nutrient exchange between the bloodstream and the filtrate. So because more solutes are reabsorbed back into blood, more water in the filtrate follows those solutes into blood, thus increasing blood volume. By the way, this concept is called osmosis. Basically, water tends to follow solutes around. Let's say you have a cup of water with a barrier in the middle that blocks out solutes, but it's only penetrable by water. If you pour salt into the right side of the cup, water from the left side will pass through the barrier and move to the right side in order to even out the salt to water ratio on both sides. So anyway, ADH and aldosterone both work to increase water retention through different mechanisms in order to increase blood volume and thus blood flow. But in order to increase blood flow to the muscles, ADH also decreases blood flow in general. Now let's talk about this. As I said earlier with insulin, hormones are global signals. They're all or nothing. So by decreasing blood flow in general, ADH makes a way for localized signals to reallocate that blood flow to the muscles. As for what those local signals are, I'll explain them in another video. But anyway, ADH accomplishes this by making the blood vessels smaller, aka vasoconstriction, because the smaller the blood vessels are, the less blood can move through. So not only do to ADH and aldosterone increase water retention, ADH is also a potent vasoconstrictor. And that's pretty much all I got for this video. So once again, the 6 fundamental hormones of exercise are epinephrine, norepinephrine, growth hormone, cortisol, ADH, and aldosterone. And they all affect exercise by activating various mechanisms of adaptive homeostasis. So the catecholamines are responsible for magnifying sympathetic tone and adaptive fuel storage breakdown. Cortisol and growth hormone are also responsible for adaptive fuel storage breakdown, and ADH and aldosterone are responsible for increasing blood flow to the muscles. I know there was honestly a lot of info in this video, and I tried my best to balance between keeping things concise but also giving enough scientific context for things to fully make sense. Whether that worked or not, I can only hope it did. But in case you need any more clarification on anything, feel free to leave a comment and I'll try my best to give a satisfactory answer. I also put down some resources in the description that I think might be helpful for understanding this. And I want to clarify lastly that I'm in fact not an expert. I'm just a college student trying to become a PT one day. So I might make an intro video explaining who I am and what this channel is for someday, but I don't know, I'll see. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video and I hope you learned a bunch. And I definitely plan on making more videos about exercise physiology or maybe even other topics someday, so stay tuned and thanks for watching.